When you're reading the Old Testament, you are covering a lot of history. When you're reading the New Testament, you're covering significant history, though in a shorter time span. So a good expository preacher must put in the historical context the passage you're studying. So for example, when you're in the New Testament, the Roman Empire is occupying Israel. That's a significant historical reality. And there is the Greek influence of philosophy and ideas. So for example, when Paul goes into Athens and goes on to Mars Hill, he's engaging with the philosophies of the Greek world. The New Testament covers less than 100 years of history. The Old Testament, by contrast, is covering more than 2,000 years of history. And so when you're studying the Old Testament in particular, it's a more challenging and daunting task to put a book and an event in its historical context and setting. So here's how I like to break down and segment the Old Testament. I start with Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, because the first 11 chapters, it's difficult to date those chapters, but obviously very, very significant and foundational. But let me just break it down, starting with Abraham. So Abraham lives around the year 2000 BC. The next huge figure is Moses. Moses comes along around the year 1500 BC. And then King David comes around the year 1000 BC. And then we have the exile in 586 BC. So just those four segments alone give us a sense of how to get our minds around where we are in the Old Testament. And then we can ask questions like, are we in Egypt? Are we in Babylon? Are we in Israel? Who's the king? Has the kingdom divided between north and south? Has the exile happened yet? Those are some of the key event markers in the Old Testament. Now in the New Testament, of course, we're looking at what happens prior to the crucifixion. What happens between the crucifixion and the resurrection? What happens between the resurrection and the ascension? What happens between the ascension and the coming of the Spirit on Pentecost? So those are some of the key benchmarks in the New Testament. Let me give you just a quick example here. Pentecost happens 50 days after Passover. Jesus is crucified on Passover. He shows himself alive for 40 days. He's in the grave for 3, so that's 43. So 43, or 50 minus 43 is 7. That would tell me that the disciples are in the upper room for approximately 7 days. So again, those are just some benchmarks, some historical benchmarks. And then you're looking at, the military conquests, Roman Empire in the New Testament, Egypt, Assyria, etc. in the Old Testament. Paying attention to these historical markers will help and support your exegetical study. This is Fred, and this is another Fred Talk. Thanks for watching.